very much for organising the meeting, and to Michelle. I'm going to focus in a bit on the UK now, and talk a bit about the UK and the arms trade, but also particularly the title of this talk got me looking at the ethics of the arms trade and made me wonder a bit about why people got involved in the arms trade and what were the motivations of people who worked in the trade or the government and politicians and officials that promote the trade or issue the export licences which are necessary to export the equipment out of the UK. I've got in front of me a very long list of repressive regimes to which successive UK governments have given support. Campaigning against arms trade has been around since 1974, and during that time it's been campaigning against the UK, giving, promoting, selling arms to the Shah in Iran, Pinochet in Chile, Galtieri in Argentina, Saddam in Iraq, Suharto in Indonesia, the Saudi royal family, Gaddafi in Libya, and then I'll add to that list because we were demonstrating against him last week, Sisi in Egypt. And what these people, or these regimes have in common, besides very appalling human rights records, is that they all have money and are willing to buy arms. So the arms sales can sometimes provide the equipment that's directly used in human rights abuses, but I think it's arguably even more important that the sales of British military equipment to those regimes gives them international credibility. It means that their human rights abuses tend to be overlooked. The UK government is willing to comment on human rights abuses when the countries are poor or not buying UK arms. But when you realise, for instance, that Saudi Arabia is about 3 from the bottom of the Economist list of the third most or fourth most authoritarian regime in the world, you will see that there's quite a lot of human rights that is overlooked for these people. Time and again, UK governments have had reason to regret this arming of dictators. Some of the weapons have been used against UK forces, or, as now, in the bombing of Saudi Arabia and Yemen, they're most likely being used in contravention of international humanitarian law. So I was wondering, how do those who make the weapons and the UK government which licenses their export sleep at night, and how can they justify it? Andrew mentioned South Africa, and he mentioned the Serious Fraud Office, which about 10 years ago was investigating BAE Systems and its sales in about 7 countries, which included Saudi Arabia, Tanzania, and South Africa. Some of the transcripts of the Serious Fraud Office interviews have turned up on a website in South Africa, and they've made quite interesting reading. And I'm going to read a bit of one from one Alan MacDonald, who was BAE's representative in South Africa at one time. He was reporting to the Serious Fraud Office on a conversation he'd had with BAE's chief executive about John Bredenkamp, who was one of these agents who Andrew writes about extensively and is often held up as one of the big arms agents. So Alan MacDonald, BAE's South Africa person, talking about his conversation with Mike Turner, reported, "I said to Mike Turner, but this guy, John Bredenkamp's got a terrible reputation. He's already seen as a gun runner." That's Alan MacDonald, says, Mike laughed at me and says, "We're all gun runners, Alan, you know. That, would you know so? I mean, the truth of it is," he says, "you're in defence marketing now. You're in and you've left commercial marketing behind. You're in defence marketing, you're a gun runner. You know, you're an arms sales dealer." And then Alan MacDonald goes on very revealingly, "I didn't feel very comfortable with that conversation. I mean, I was never very comfortable in that position." But he'd say to himself, "I've got 5 kids and they're all at private school, you know. So the only way I could get the salary to justify was to continue to work at the headquarters of BAE and to do this job. But, you know, the more I got into defence, the more I was a commercial aircraft man through and through. brought up in commercial, and then suddenly I was in, and he's kind of quite clear in this. This guy who was selling this equipment that Andrew has mentioned, this equipment the South African government didn't need, he himself could see through it, but he still went on with it because it earned him a living. So that was one guy who felt very uncomfortable. But what about others? What are the other justifications they use? Well, from the 19th century, when there were armourers around such Armstrong, whose company then became part of Vickers Armstrong, right up to BAE's former chair, Dick Evelyn, there's been a kind of strand of them have said it's just engineering. It's a general refusal to see that the products they're making are different to other manufacturing. They say they're just another product, engineering product. And they won't see that their product can kill. And that even if their product isn't used in anger, there's a waste of resources there. And some workers might not even know that what they're making is actually going into weaponry. We had one company that got in touch with Campaign Against Arms Trade that was so horrified that some of its components had been sold on to an arms company to be used in weaponry, that they gave CAAT the very modest sum they had made out of it. But they also re-educated their sales staff. So there are people out there who are actually part of the trade who don't know it. So this idea is just engineering, and in a way it is, but it is the product that is the problem. Then the big killer argument that we find time and time again, it's jobs. And BAE's Alan MacDonald said he needed a job. And there are indeed lots of jobs in the arms industry. And a lot of the workers are among the most skilled engineers out there. However, the jobs are only in the arms industry because it is subsidised. If you transfer the subsidy and support another industry, you can transfer those jobs. Now today there's a shortage of scientists and engineers. You've probably seen that's regularly reported in the newspapers and in the media generally. And those skilled people are very much needed to tackle challenges today in the world, not least in renewable energy. Now, CAAT's produced an Arms to Renewables report that shows very much the kind of jobs currently in the arms industry could be transferred to the renewables industry where they're needed. But it's the transition that's the problem. And the unions, of course, support the jobs that exist rather than jobs that might be. So it's quite a strong argument to get, it's quite a difficult argument to get across. But we need the government to take a lead here. We need the government to make a choice to transfer the arms jobs to the renewables jobs. And they don't make that choice so far. There's another argument, which Andrew touched on, which was national, I think Norman did too, of national security. It's an often made argument, but its validity may vary with the times. My father, as a teenager, worked for an engineering company which with the outbreak of World War II, switched from making engines generally to making engines for fighter aircraft. And although I identify as a pacifist, I couldn't put myself in that position. I don't know what I'd have done in 1939, but what I do know is that today, when it is said that the arms industry is vital to national security, it isn't national security that BAE and the other arms companies are thinking about. They're thinking about their profits. And if the government is willing to back their industry, they are willing to keep going with it. It's also a myth that the arms industry is vital to national security, that you need your own military industry to keep the supply lines going. When you think that 40% of the components in UK-produced arms are actually coming from overseas. So it's a global industry, components coming from all over the place. It isn't a national industry, primarily there to arm the UK armed forces. And then, as I mentioned earlier, what we do know, on the contrary, is that arms sales give moral support to regimes such as Saudi Arabia, which is the country that's exporting its hardline policies, its hardline version of Islam around the Middle East. It is Saudi Arabia, I would argue, that's causing a lot of the problems. It certainly isn't the solution to arm it. And then, of course, the national security in the arms industry, it takes resources away from things that are non-military threats to our national security, from tackling stuff such as climate change or inequality or this potential problem with antibiotic-resistant disease. There are lots of big threats to national security that are in no way military, but the kind of conflation of national security with military matters and military equipment, the needs for military equipment, is really something that needs to be challenged. So why does it continue? Well, the links between the arms industry and government, as pointed out, very, very strong, that continue all the time. In Campaign Against Arms Trade's hoping to have an online browser by the beginning of next year where you can look up and see these links. All those meetings where officials are meeting daily with BAE Systems, with Lockheed Martin's UK's division, and where people leave government, people like Jeff Hoon, who was mentioned, and go onto the boards of the arms companies. In his case, Augusta Westland. It's been going on for a long time, this link. I think Michelle, who set up this meeting, got involved with Campaign Against Arms Trade on our Arming All Sides project, looking at the arms industry in the First World War. Well, there was a guy there, a Labour MP called Philip Snowden, and in his speech about naval estimates to the House of Commons in March 1914, he said that so many MPs were shareholders that it's not possible to throw a stone at benches opposite without hitting one. So there were a lot of people with arms company shares back in 1914. We haven't actually looked at MP shareholdings today. MPs per se are probably not that significant in this revolving door as the officials and, as I say, ex-ministers going through. One of those people that will be highlighting the links between the arms companies and government is a guy called Sir Sherard Cowper-Coles. Now, he was Britain's ambassador to Saudi Arabia when he pressured the Serious Fraud Office to drop its investigation to BAE's Saudi sales. And on leaving the Foreign Office, he was given a job with BAE. So it's one of those key revolving doors. And then there's the problem of inertia. There's the problem that governments have always done it, so that's the kind of status quo. But the arms trade is being challenged. It's a trade that's long been questioned, but I would suggest that the questioning is becoming more and more prevalent these days. I've noticed that when in the 1980s, we've got a lot of files in our office, and if you read back over the press statements about those BAE deals with Saudi, when they were being negotiated in the 1980s, the newspapers did not question them at all. When David Cameron went on a sales trip to Saudi a couple of years ago, even the Telegraph and some of those kind of papers at least put the word controversial in front of deal and things like that. So I think we're making a bit of progress there. So the campaigning is beginning, at least the idea that this is not acceptable to everyone is beginning to happen. Now, one parliamentary matter I'm winding up in a moment that I'm just going to mention that's also played a great role was the Committees on Arms Export Controls. They started in 1998 when politicians from 4 select committees, I suspect most people here know the select committees which monitor each government, backbench MPs from across the parties, which monitor the government's action in each department. Well, from 4 select committees, which was Foreign Affairs, Defence, International Development and Trade, which has had different names over the years, representatives then came together in 1998 to look at the government and arms sales. And that's done enormously good work, I would argue particularly during the last Parliament, when Sir John Stanley, who was a Conservative MP, now sadly retired, a former Conservative Defence Minister, he chaired that committee and it did sterling work in raising the issue of the arms trade in Parliament. It was a multi-party committee and under his chair. It hasn't been unless it's happened today, it hasn't been re-established in this Parliament. So it's something that we'd very much like to see, and I know some MPs are on the case of that very strongly. So we want the issue raised. We want it raised in the press, at events, in any way possible. And it's an issue that's now got 70% of UK adults opposing the promotion of arms exports to repressive regimes. So I think we are gradually getting there. We haven't got there yet, but it is an issue we want to make controversial. It is an issue that is controversial. Now we want to move from being controversial to actually stopping it.